How often in life do we want to come across as cool, calm, and collected on the outside, but on the inside we feel more like this, more like hot, bothered, and stressed internally? And things can be going objectively quite well, but inevitably that little doubting voice comes in saying, "Are you sure?" Or "People are onto you and they'll figure out who you really are, just you wait." Or "You do know this good time will come to an end, don't you?" So what we're going to try to do in this lesson is figure out what this voice is really trying to say but is struggling to, what it's trying to protect us from, how we can actually reframe this doubting, critical voice into a reassuring one that is doing its best to look after us, and to plot out all of this visually so that it's easier to visualize to see what is going on in the moment. So first of all, why do we actually have this voice to begin with? Well, imagine that you are a younger version of yourself just for a moment, maybe 5 years old at primary school, and the teacher asks you a question and you think you know the answer, so you confidently raise your hand to answer it, but your answer is wrong. And it's not just wrong, but it's completely wrong. And all the other students who clearly knew the answer start quietly laughing and smirking about just how wrong your answer is. Now, immediately, the 5-year-old version of you is going to feel extremely self-conscious. It's embarrassing and it's humiliating, and you just want the ground to swallow you up in a moment like this. But time goes on and you survive this ordeal, but you become a little bit more self-conscious about offering answers in the future, just in case you're wrong again. More specifically, just in case you embarrass yourself again and other students laugh. So over time, the memory of the original issue is lost, and we're left only with the judgment of the issue and the emotions and the physical discomfort that comes along with it. And as the months and the years go by, with the original memory being long in the past, this internalizes over time as this critical inner voice. This gives birth to what I'm going to call in this lesson the inner critic. And you might relate to a different version of that story, or realize that you first became self-conscious at a different age. Or you might call this inner chatter something else entirely, but it's an experience that is common to a lot of us. And we can take a food-based example from the book recommendation for today itself, which is Embracing Your Inner Critic. So to quote page 7, which I'll leave on here for you to read through if you're interested. "The issue is no longer the meaning of food in our lives and how we use it and need it to handle stress and anxiety. The issue is now how to handle the attack of an out-of-control critical voice that has turned eating into a major disease. The original issue is lost, and the critic is now the problem." And that's the key point with all this. So whatever the scenario might be originally that led us onto this does lead us to this first key point, which is that the inner critic's original function is to spare us from shame and from pain. These external judgments leave us feeling vulnerable and wide open, and that's far too much to live with, especially as a child. So to keep us from experiencing the harsh judgments externally, the inner critic preempts them and gives us essentially a lesser than two evils approach by giving us an internal harsh judgment instead to steer us away from whatever we were about to do. It tells us in one form or another, there is something wrong with you. And if we choose to believe this, then we're going to try to avoid the experience altogether and play it safe. So in our original example, that would be not offering any more answers in the classroom, just in case you embarrass yourself again, which is both pain and shame. So this sets up this inner tension. We want to be accepted by others and to seek fulfillment and to get recognition, to go out into the world and do things, to experience a sense of achievement, anything else like that. But at the same time, we're also extremely anxious to the point of desperation of wanting to avoid being humiliated and embarrassed if this goes wrong. So again, just to make it really clear, to avoid feelings of pain and shame. So we've got this seemingly impossible battle between wanting to be truly ourselves and unique and individual, whilst also desperately seeking to be accepted and approved of and liked by others. So fans of Carl Jung at this point will probably see a shadow versus persona tension developing here. I'm intentionally going to avoid the jargon for this, but this battle between the inner and the outer facing personalities is definitely relevant here. So at the bottom line, the inner critic really just wants you to be okay. It developed at a young age to help you fit in and be accepted by the adults and the authority figures around you. But this leads us on to the key point, our second key point. It'll continue to treat you as though you were that age, that young child, unless you update the story. And for a child, the potential for things to go wrong is never ending, as we're completely reliant on others. So the inner critic, if it's left to its own devices, will never stop, because there's always going to be something to be worried about. So we've covered quite a lot of information already. So just to summarize the lesson so far, we can draw all of this out visually in this way. So we've got the original issue. It's going to be a very rough diagram. We've got the original issue. This gives birth to the inner critic. The inner critic then tries to help us avoid feelings of pain and feelings of shame. But over time, we forget what the original issue was, and we're left with this enduring problem of dealing with this out of control, critical inner voice. So what we need to do is to learn how to accept this voice so that we can hear its message, specifically so that we can hear it as a cry for help. And if you'll notice in all of this, I'm not using the word tolerate. So consider the difference between acceptance and tolerance within a friendship specifically, just to make this clear. There's a big difference between accepting a friend for all their positives and despite their imperfections, and tolerating them and their imperfections. You can probably tell just even like the tone of my voice as I'm saying it. This isn't an endurance event. We're not trying to put up with them. What makes that friendship so valuable is that they are a real person, which means that we have to accept them wholesale. The parts that we find easy to like and the parts that we might find challenging at times. And it's exactly the same with the inner critic, which is what leads us on to our third key point for this lesson. We need to accept the inner critic's concerns and listen to them, and then begin a dialogue with it to start embracing it rather than banishing it just because we don't like what it has to say. So if we jump to the exact opposite end of the book, to page 177, we have this lovely idea. In fact, I've even written at the top, good 2 pages to make it even clearer. So I'll leave this on the screen if you want to read through all of it, but just to simplify it down, we need to go beneath the criticisms of the inner critic and convert your distress to understanding. You must always remember how and why the critic was born. So what we need to do is we need to get underneath the critic and to uproot it. Now, if it helps, here's how I picture something like this when I read something like this in a book. So let's say this full circle represents my personality and who I think I am. So we'll put that as Billy. At the bottom, we're going to have a closed off bubble here. And that is going to represent my inner child. Just to be fairly vague about this. So my adult personality has emerged from this. It's emerged on top of this and out of this. So it's still going to be within this circle. And the inner critic lives here. It lives on this threshold between the two. So like I was saying from that quote, what we need to do is to get underneath. We need to uproot the inner critic and allow the inner child to access the wider parts of who we are instead of it just being buried at the bottom. And you could equally word that in the exact opposite way as well, allowing the wider parts of us to access the inner child. And the more we learn to accept it and update our story to realize that the feelings of pain and shame aren't as terrible in our adult lives as they were when we were young children, the more we start to poke some holes into that threshold. So what we can do is we can think about it, again, we'll consider it the exact same way here. We've still got my adult personality, so that is Billy. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make this a habit and a process that we can rely on so we can pierce more and more holes into this armor. So if I write out the inner child here, instead of it being at the bottom, we're uprooting it and it's got a bit more of a permeable boundary. So what we're trying to do is pierce more and more holes into that armor, and through a sort of psychological osmosis, we allow the energy of the inner child to diffuse into our wider personality. So just like how a diffuser might smell strong at first, but over time the scent of the whole room has changed to be more pleasant than just that one section of the room, it's exactly the same here. I appreciate I've used some quite vague and poetic language there, but I hope you understand the imagery that I'm getting at. So taking care of the inner critic is taking care of your inner child, a younger version of yourself. So we need to listen to the critic, see what message it's trying to pass on from the inner child as a cry for help, and then work together as a team, as a little trio, to try to solve this problem. So as a little trio, we've got the adult, we've got the inner critic, and we've got the child. So what we're trying to do is to create a little internal community where we can all rely on each other. So in my case, adult Billy can hear the warning signs from the inner critic, appreciate that it's trying to do a good job of sparing childhood Billy from pain and shame and humiliation and embarrassment, but crucially what we're doing is we are updating the story. We're reminding the inner critic that this is no longer relevant because now I'm 30 years old. I'm not 5. Adult Billy has got this. We can trust him. Specifically, childhood Billy can trust adult Billy. And adult Billy can thank the inner critic for letting him know. And that's going to be another key point in all of this. To get this inner critic on side, it's not about judgments, but it's about acceptance and gratitude and giving thanks for what it's trying to do, even if it's not doing it in the most effective way. And this takes time. So don't expect overnight results, but hopefully that diagram helps to picture the psychogeography of the situation. And as the absolute minimum, we need a commitment to take the inner child and the inner critic seriously. In the same way that we should take a literal child seriously and not reduce it down to an object, we should do the same internally. We want the inner critic on board because ultimately it's going to lead us to a more fulfilling and creative life. And that is exactly why the subtitle for this book is Turning Self-Criticism into a Creative Asset. I really, really love this book. I've recommended it before and I'm going to continue recommending it again far, far into the future. So we've covered quite a lot in this lesson. So I'm going to do a quick little recap. The inner critic helped us to avoid feelings of pain and feelings of shame. That was our first diagram. Then the inner critic acts as a barrier that keeps the child, the inner child, protected from the outside world, forgetting or not even realizing that we're now adults and that we can actually handle the situation without being overwhelmed. So we need to learn to see the inner critic's messages as cries for help, not harsh criticisms. So to do this, we need to get underneath the inner critic's attacks and listen to the message of the child and then take it seriously. So then over time, we learn to embrace it more and more and we move into a more fulfilling future as a team, as a little power trio of adult self and inner critic and childhood self. And I hope those diagrams make sense because that's how I picture it, at least. It's by no means the right or the wrong answer, but it is one to consider at the very least. So if we return to our images from the beginning of this video, we can only effectively come across as cool, calm and collected on the outside if we're going to be cool, calm and collected on the inside. There's got to be a sense of authenticity and resonance between the inner and the outer, because otherwise the inner critic, if it's left to its own devices, is mercilessly going to let you know that there's a divide between the two. So the next time the inner critic says something like, people are onto you, they'll figure out who you really are, just you wait, we can listen to its message and continue that conversation further. So we could say something like, okay, what exactly will they figure out about me? Or you might say something like, who am I really? If you're aware of something that I'm not, could you please let me know? And it's by continuing that conversation rather than stopping it when you're feeling at your lowest that you'll be able to transform this inner chatter into something which is a lot more practical. So give yourself permission to be imperfect or capable of mistakes and inefficient. And also the reminder that if we do experience pain or shame, then it's not permanent and we can do something about it to solve that problem. It's a really, really wonderful little book, Embracing Your Inner Critic. My copy is getting quite battered, as you can probably see, because I've just come back to this so many times, and I'm going to continue doing so in the future as well. But I'm aware that we're coming up to 15 minutes, so that's it for now, and I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.